The air in Los Angeles, in the first bleak weeks of January 1947, was thick with the strange post-war tension of a city trying to find its footing, a cocktail of Hollywood glamour, returning veterans, and a burgeoning, dark underside that no one wanted to admit existed. The war was over, but the darkness had simply changed uniforms, and it was about to stalk the streets of the burgeoning metropolis, ready to commit a crime that would forever etch the city's name into the grim history of unsolved violence. This is the story of Elizabeth Short, a young woman who arrived in the City of Angels with dreams as ephemeral as the movie studio's smoke, only to become the tragic centerpiece of a murder so savage, so meticulously staged, that it would transcend true crime and become a cornerstone of American noir, the enduring, haunting legend of the Black Dahlia. It is a story not of a soft case, but of a wound that never healed, a mystery that swallowed the truth whole, and the decades-long obsession to reclaim the humanity of a life lost to a monster's terrible artistry. To the world she became the Black Dahlia, a moniker as cold and brittle as glass, bestowed upon her by the cynical, sensationalist press. But to her family and friends, she was simply Betty, or sometimes Beth. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in the town of Hyde Park, Massachusetts, a world away from the sun-drenched, treacherous streets of Southern California. Her childhood was marked by sudden instability. Her father, Cleo Short, a man who built miniature golf courses, reportedly parked his car near a bridge in 1930 and vanished, leading the family to believe he had committed suicide. Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, moved the 5 daughters to Medford, Massachusetts, and struggled to raise them through the lean years of the Depression. Elizabeth, quiet and sensitive, was deeply affected by her father's absence and the family's financial strain. A chronic, debilitating asthma condition led Elizabeth to spend much of her teenage years in Florida, seeking better air away from the damp New England climate. It was here, and later in the burgeoning chaos of the American wartime machine, that the restless spirit inside her began to stir. She was a beautiful young woman, striking with her naturally brown hair that she often dyed of deep, inky black, a color that would later feed the press's morbid fascination. She had light blue eyes and a slight, lithe figure, but perhaps her most distinct feature was the way she carried herself, a sense of longing, a need for escape. She had what the era called Hollywood aspirations. She dreamed not necessarily of being a star, but of being around stars, around the glamour, around the heat of the action. She worked various transient jobs, waitress, cashier, but her real currency was her dazzling looks, her youth, and the magnetic pull of her presence. She was perpetually drawn to the uniforms of the Second World War, seeking stability and excitement in the company of servicemen. In 1943, she met an Air Force major named Matthew Gordon and nearly married him, but their engagement ended tragically when his plane crashed overseas. This loss, sources suggest, only deepened her restless, sometimes reckless wandering. By 1946, Elizabeth was adrift, pulled by the siren call of the West Coast. She arrived in Los Angeles, where her father had, in fact, resurfaced after his supposed death, a revelation that itself spoke to a deep family dysfunction. She lived a nomadic existence, moving constantly between cheap hotels, boarding houses, and the couches of various acquaintances, often failing to pay rent. Her life was a transient, hand-to-mouth scramble, yet she was always impeccably dressed, favoring black suits, black gloves, and a look that was part film noir fantasy, part desperate necessity. She was known to date dozens of men, primarily servicemen or veterans, allowing them to buy her meals and provide temporary shelter, always holding out the promise of a relationship, while maintaining a careful, almost professional distance. The myth that she was a Hollywood starlet or a prostitute was a creation of the salacious press, a way to package her tragedy for consumption. The truth was simpler and perhaps more heartbreaking. Elizabeth Short was a beautiful, lonely, 22-year-old girl, lost in a vast city, desperately trying to construct a stable life out of scattered dreams and misplaced hope, a vulnerability that made her the perfect target for a killer who was looking for exactly that, a solitary light in the endless, hungry night of Los Angeles. The final known movements of Elizabeth Short are pieced together from fragmented, often contradictory accounts, forming a timeline that ends in a terrifying void. Her last days were spent in San Diego, staying with a married pipe clamp salesman named Robert Red Manley. Manley, who was attracted to Short but maintained he had only a platonic relationship with her, agreed to drive her back to Los Angeles on January 8th. Elizabeth told Manley she was traveling to meet her older sister, Virginia, whom she claimed was coming to Los Angeles from the East Coast. Manley later reported he dropped her off near the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on January 9th. The Biltmore was a grand, ornate hub of activity, the perfect place for a young woman hoping to disappear into the crowd or make a grand entrance. The sighting at the Biltmore is the last confirmed and irrefutable sighting of Elizabeth Short alive. Manley watched her go into the hotel lobby, and he drove away. From that moment, around 10 a.m. on Thursday, January 9th, Elizabeth Short entered a 6-day zone of silence. What happened next is a tapestry of unverified claims, rumor, and intense police investigation. Some witnesses claimed to have seen her using a payphone in the Biltmore lobby. Others placed her at the Crown Grill cocktail lounge that same day, suggesting she was waiting for someone, perhaps a friend, perhaps a date, or perhaps the person who would become her killer. The police investigation, which began later, was a frantic attempt to fill this 6-day gap, January 9th to the night of January 14th. This missing week, as it became known, was the core of the mystery. Where did she stay? Who was she with? Did she ever meet her sister, or was that a convenient lie to explain her travel? Detectives traced her movements through every restaurant, every bar in the area, but Elizabeth, with her transient lifestyle, was adept at leaving few permanent footprints. She was already accustomed to blending in, moving on, and not drawing scrutiny, habits that suddenly became a terrifying obstacle to finding the truth. The weather that week was typical for a Los Angeles winter: cool nights, bright, crisp days, but beneath the veneer of sun, the darkness was deepening. The person who took her, whoever they were, had the patience and the means to hold her for days, torturing her, performing surgical mutilations, and ultimately draining her body of blood before the final act. The sheer scale of the violence suggested an intimate, personal hatred, a prolonged psychological and physical assault that required privacy and a frightening level of control. The killer didn't rush. He had time. The final, unsettling realization is that Elizabeth Short spent her last days enduring a nightmare, not on a movie set or in a glamorous hotel, but in a hidden, terrifying place, held captive by a predator whose identity remains one of the greatest secrets of the 20th century. The silence of those 6 days is the true, most haunting character in the entire Black Dahlia saga. The nightmare ended, and the public horror began on the morning of Wednesday, January 15, 1947. The setting was a vacant, weedy lot on South Norton Avenue in the residential Learmert Park area of Los Angeles. Around 10 a.m., a local housewife named Betty Berzinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter. As they crossed the overgrown lot, Betty saw something startling: a flash of unnatural white against the drab brown wheat. The air in Los Angeles, in the first bleak weeks of January 1947, was thick with the strange post-war tension of a city trying to find its footing, a cocktail of Hollywood glamour, returning veterans, and a burgeoning dark underside that no one wanted to admit existed. The war was over, but the darkness had simply changed uniforms, and it was about to stalk the streets of the burgeoning metropolis, ready to commit a crime that would forever etch the city's name into the grim history of unsolved violence. This is the story of Elizabeth Short, a young woman who arrived in the City of Angels with dreams as ephemeral as the movie studio smoke, only to become the tragic centerpiece of a murder so savage, so meticulously staged, that it would transcend true crime and become a cornerstone of American noir, the enduring, haunting legend of the Black Dahlia. It is a story not of a solved case, but of a wound that never healed, a mystery that swallowed the truth whole, and the decades-long obsession to reclaim the humanity of a life lost to a monster's terrible artistry. To
the cold case years, the enduring shadow of Noir. The Black Dahlia case did not simply go cold, it fossilized into myth. For the rest of the 20th century, the image of Elizabeth Short, the hauntingly posed, bisected body, became an iconic fixture of American crime history, a symbol of broken Hollywood dreams and the dark underbelly of the 40s. For Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, and her surviving sisters, the decades were a prolonged public agony. The media's relentless portrayal of Elizabeth as a party girl or streetwalker further mutilated her memory, replacing the reality of a lonely, dreaming young woman with a sensationalized caricature. Phoebe had to read the details of her daughter's suffering in the papers, often exaggerated and distorted, while the killer lived free. Their pain was private, immense, and ultimately eclipsed by the relentless noise of the case's public mythology. The LAPD never truly closed the file. It became a legacy case, a heavy, voluminous record periodically assigned to a new generation of detectives. For any detective in Los Angeles, the Dahlia file was the holy grail and the albatross, a chance for immortality, but a likely path to professional frustration. Each new officer would review the massive files, interview the dwindling few surviving witnesses, and run the same pieces of physical evidence through whatever new forensic tools the time afforded. In the 1970s and 80s, the emergence of AI, or alternative intelligence, or advanced fingerprint analysis, offered a momentary spark. Fingerprints were recovered from the taunting letters and the gasoline-wiped belongings sent to the examiner. Yet decades of running these prints through local and federal databases yielded nothing. The killer was either not in the system, or the prints were too smudged, too partial, to ever be conclusively matched. The case remained alive, not through official police breakthroughs, but through a persistent stream of amateur sleuths, crime writers, and former police officers. This period cemented the suspect of the decade phenomenon. Jack Anderson Wilson, named by author John Gilmore as a drifter and alcoholic acquaintance of Short. Walter Bailey, a wealthy playboy and prominent surgeon whose alleged connection to a network of high society crime was proposed by a former associate. The serial killer theory. Connections were often drawn to the unsolved Cleveland torso murders, the Kingsbury Run murders, which featured similar deliberate dismemberment, suggesting a traveling serial killer with surgical skill. The most compelling and arguably the most enduring theory to emerge in the 21st century focused on one name that had briefly appeared on the 1949 suspect list, a man who had since passed into the history books, Dr. George Hill Hodel. This theory, championed by Hodel's own son, retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel, would inject new life and the chilling sense of closure into the cold case file. The Dahlia file had been waiting for a new generation, a new perspective, to finally read the evidence it had preserved for decades. The breakthrough, the sun and the secret. The long silence of the Black Dahlia case was finally challenged not by police breakthrough, but a personal, familial obsession. In the early 2000s, retired Los Angeles police homicide detective Steve Hodel began a private investigation into his late father, Dr. George Hill Hodel Jr. Dr. George Hodel was a brilliant, eccentric, and dark figure.
A prominent physician in Los Angeles society during the 1940s, specializing in venereal diseases. He ran in high society and intellectual circles, even socializing with figures like Man Ray. But his veneer of respectability was shattered in 1949, when his 14-year-old daughter, Tamara Hodel, accused him of sexual abuse. During the ensuing investigation of George Hodel for incest, the LAPD tapped his phone, resulting in a series of shocking recordings. In one chilling, distorted moment, Hodel is recorded saying, in reference to a secretary who was murdered and whose case had similarities to the Dahlia murder, "Subproven I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They couldn't talk to my secretary because she's dead." The police had their suspicions at the time, given his medical knowledge and dark reputation, but the evidence was deemed insufficient to pursue a murder charge. Holden was ultimately acquitted on the incest charge and fled the country in 1950, living in Asia for decades, convinced the police were after him. Years later, after George Holden's death in 1999, Steve Holden inherited his father's belongings. Among his personal effects, Steve found a cryptic photo album. Inside, amidst family pictures, were two photographs, one of a strikingly beautiful dark-haired woman who strongly resembled Elizabeth Short, and another of a woman who appeared to be short, but posed in a way that was undeniably unsettling. This discovery launched Steve Holden's personal crusade. As a seasoned homicide detective, he began to apply modern forensics and investigative techniques to the decades-old evidence, seeing it now through the lens of one highly specific suspect, his own father. The true breakthrough, however, lay not in the photos, but in the re-examination of physical evidence surrounding Holden's properties. George Hodel owned the Southern House in Los Feliz, a famous striking Mayan revival-style home designed by Lloyd Wright, Frank Wright's son. It was a massive secluded property, perfect for committing a long, torturous crime without detection. When Hodel's house and land were later scanned, dogs trained to detect human remains hit on the property. Furthermore, receipts were later discovered showing George Hodel had purchased 5-pound bags of the same size and brand of concrete that were found near Short's body at the discovery site, believed to have been used to transport or stabilize the body. The connection, though circumstantial, was irrefutable enough to make Dr. George Hodel the single most forensically viable suspect in the modern era of the case. The technology of the two Delsings, DNA profiling, was also applied, but the samples from the 1947 autopsy, collected from a time when forensic preservation was non-existent, were too degraded, or the original samples had been compromised, lost, or consumed in earlier, less advanced testing. The case was unique. The potential identity of the killer was now clearer than ever, but the scientific bridge of DNA, the ultimate proof, remained tragically broken. The search for the truth. The Phantom Killer. The investigative focus on Dr. George Holden was a powerful example of recontextualized cold casework. The case was now less about finding a new anonymous killer and more about proving what the 1949 police unit had only been able to suspect before Holden fled. Steve Holden's work, published in his series of books, introduced a chilling pattern of evidence. The medical MO. Dr. Hodel possessed the precise surgical knowledge necessary for the hemicorporatory and the other mutilations. The Glasgow smile was an established surgical procedure at the time. The femme fatale connection. Hortolo knows to be obsessed with the surrealist art movement, particularly the photography of Man Ray, who often posed and photographed female nudes in highly stylized, unsettling ways. The crime scene, the bisected body, display pose, the intentional staging, was argued to be an attempt by Hodel to create his own grotesque work of surrealist art, using Elizabeth Short's body as his canvas. The phone taps. The 1949 phone transcripts of George Hodel, previously dismissed, were re-evaluated by modern law enforcement experts and deemed incredibly incriminating. The police had a verbal confession, however cryptic, recorded on the old wiretaps. Despite the compelling nature of the evidence, the case remains officially unsolved. Why? The central tragedy of the Black Dahlia case is the destruction and degradation of evidence in 1947. When the press and curious civilians swarmed the Leimert Park lot, they destroyed what little trace evidence may have existed. The subsequent investigation was also not focused on collecting latent DNA evidence, a concept that would not exist for another 40 years. The most promising biological evidence, the samples collected at autopsy, either contained no viable sperm, as per the 1947 report, or were too compromised by the years of storage to yield a definitive DNA profile for comparison against the Hodel family line. Other theories continued to hold sway, creating a never-ending cycle of public speculation and literary output. The most notable alternate theory was detailed by P.U. Eatwell in her book, which named Leslie Dillon as the killer, alleging he worked under the direction of nightclub owner Mark Hansen. This theory also highlights the corruption within the police department at the time.